So thank you for joining me for this professional learning this afternoon. It's so great to see all of you again, and some of you look very familiar to me, and I know we've got some new faces this afternoon. So this workshop follows on from the first online workshop on strategies for effective literacy teaching, this book. However, as I was saying before, if you haven't attended that first workshop, don't worry. But hi, I'm Libby. I'm a teacher in the ACT. I ran about 10 of the first workshop in this series from the beginning of this year until about August, so we had quite a lot of them. If you do have extra questions throughout this afternoon, please feel free to ask them. I love an interactive group. And also at the end, we'll have some question time. If you didn't attend the first workshop but you're interested in it, on the ALEA website under National Professional Learning, there are some recordings of that first workshop, so you can actually buy yourself a recording of me talking. How wonderful. But it's a great resource. If you didn't actually get to attend that first workshop, you can grab the recording and you can have a listen to it. There are also going to be some workshops that might pop up online in the future as well for ALEA. So make sure that you keep an eye on ALEA on the Facebook page and their website. So a few of us have already introduced ourselves already, but I think it's a nice time to do that at the very beginning of the workshop. I know that we're a different bunch, that if you did join us before, a different bunch this time than from last time. So let us know who you are, where you are, and what age groups you're working with. And I think a few people have already done this, but I know that a few people have stayed very quiet. So if everyone would like to introduce themselves, that would be great. So where you are, what age group you're working with. And this just helps me to make sure that I cater to all of you as well. So I'm just going to grab a pen and write it down. Who would you like to start?
Hi, we're from St Francis College in Chrismead in Logan City in Queensland.
Lovely.
And there's 4 of us here this afternoon, and we mainly work in the primary section of town, but we do have one lady who does EALD work, who speaks Arabic and does a lot of translation work as well as support for the children.
Great. And so you work from foundation to year 6 or preschool?
Prep, we call it prep here, prep to year 6. Yeah.
Awesome. Lovely to meet you all. Thank you. Who else is out there tonight or this afternoon?
Hi, I'm Geraldine. I am at St Peter's College in Adelaide, and I work primarily with year 3s to year 6s. I have worked with some year 3s, but mostly with a learning assistant program. So using a literacy program, a prescribed literacy program. And I have to say I was very fortunate to actually work with Chris Lever, who is one of the authors of...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's so wonderful.
I was at primary school for a while.
Yeah.
So it's good to be able to tap into her resource.
That's wonderful.
Sorry, Libby, I just lost everything, so I had to rejoin. So I've only just got back on.
We're just introducing ourselves, so now would be a great time for you to be able to introduce yourself, Louise, as well to everyone.
Okay, my name's Louise Buchholz. I work at Mother Teresa Primary School with Siham, who's also doing the webinar.
What state is that in?
We're New South Wales, Westmead, New South Wales. We are kinder to year 6 primary school with Parramatta Marist and Catherine Macaulay located next door. So we're in a rather big complex.
Yeah, and you're
growing all the time. We were on the news the other week.
You're working across the school as well, Louise?
Mainly in infants. At this year I've been with year 2 mainly, but I've done all grades.
Great. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks.
I can see there are a few other people out there that If you don't want to use the mic, that's fine. You can introduce yourselves on the chat and I'll read it out for you as well.
I'll introduce. I'm Michelle Ridley, and this is Michelle Bartley. The campsite. Where's
Hi, Michelle.
St. Bede's, Braidwood?
Sorry, where are you from?
St. Bede's in Braidwood.
Okay, lovely.
Yes.
Yep, yep. You just cut out a little bit there.
Okay.
And what year groups are you working with?
We're primary, K to 6.
Okay, wow, busy.
Yes.
Across all the year groups. I will apologise as well. The training rooms that I'm working in, the lights like to turn off every now and then because they expect people to be running training and walking around, not sitting still. So if I do have to do some crazy hand gestures, that's why. Who else do we have here? Anyone else? Do we have anyone from Tasmania with us today? No? No Tassies? Anyone from the ACT other than me? I don't think so. There you go. Okay. Well, we've got a range of people from around Australia. I think there are a few people still that haven't introduced themselves, so I'll give you a moment if you want to introduce yourselves on the chat. You've got time to do that now as well. Yeah, we've got a range of people from around Australia tonight, and with a wealth of knowledge like this, I'm sure that we're going to learn a lot from each other as well. So as we go through the evening, if you have ideas or things that you'd like to suggest, feel free to put them in the chat. I can see Robin's just introduced herself there on the chat as well. So Robin's the person who's done all the hard work behind our workshops, and she's come to say hi from ALEA as well. If you do need any assistance after the workshop, or you want to know about more workshops, please feel free to get in touch with Robin as well. She's the one who's been sending emails. Hi, Siam. Year 6 and Year 2. Great. Okay. So let's get started. This is workshop 2. Let's hope the sequel is as good as the first, but it's hard to always know with sequels. And you guys, the first group doing the teacher assistant or teacher aid course as well. So, you know, this is a time when we're figuring out what strategies are really helpful for you guys. And for those that didn't join the first workshop, I worked as a teacher's assistant before I was a teacher. And so I feel like I could have done a lot better work if I'd known the things that I know now. I've been lucky enough to work with some incredible teacher assistants throughout the years, and the ones that always are remarkable are the ones that have that initiative to take on things and yeah, just help out in the classroom, and ones that have the knowledge behind them as well. So hopefully what I shared this evening can be helpful for you in your context. But if you are feeling like, oh, how does this relate? Or Olivia, I've got a few questions about this. How could I implement this with the kids that I work with? Feel free to ask me, because I know that the contexts that you all work in are quite different. Some of you might be working one-on-one with students. Some of you might be working in groups of students. Some of you might just be working in entire classes and almost working with every kid in the class as the teacher does their own thing as well. So because you're all working in really different contexts, I really want this to contextualize to where you are. Please feel free to ask questions and ask, how would this work? So during this session, we're going to go over the following strategies, and these ones are complementary to those that I covered in the first workshop. So I might refer to some of those first set of strategies as we go through. To begin with, we'll explore some strategies that directly link to those that I covered in the first workshop. So I'll explain how these can link to add depth to the literacy work that you might be doing. Following this, I'll go over a few strategies that are presented in the book, which I would say are alternate ways of kind of teaching similar skills. And finally, I'd like to look at a few additional strategies that I think are just a lot of fun and can really enhance your teaching. And then there'll be some time for questions at the end of the session. So like the first workshop, I'm going to briefly explain the strategy. I'll give some examples of how I've used it in my classroom teaching, and some examples of how you might use it in your work. And there'll be time for you to practice and develop your knowledge on the strategies. But will be through activities and discussion, so it is quite interactive in that sense. So the first few strategies we'll look at are complementary to those that were covered in the first workshop, and they'll assist you to go deeper with that original set of strategies and get more from them. If you're unfamiliar with these strategies that I mentioned, then feel free to have a flick to them in the book as well as we go, or just note it on the page as well. So have your book handy. If you don't have it with you now, go and grab it. If you don't have your book at all near you, then grab a piece of paper, because we're going to start off with our first strategy, author study, and this is on page 7. So if you want to click to page 7 so you can make notes as we talk. So throughout the first series of strategies, you might notice that a lot of them, and a lot of the strategies in the book, really rely on you having quality texts. Read aloud, guided reading, reading conferences. So it makes sense that one strategy that assists you to ensure that you have quality texts is an author study. So this strategy, if you see it in a classroom work, it's not something that really needs particularly dedicated time to it. It's more of a theme than anything else. So it might, you know, you might have a few minutes here or there to mention that you're actually focusing on a particular author, but it doesn't need to be allocated, okay, we're going to sit down and do author study now. What it does do though is it opens up your students' eyes to potential reading material for themselves. Like I remember discovering Morris Gleitzman when I was in primary school just from my teacher doing an author study on him. You know, she read all his books, she explained who he was, we did, you know, some pretend interviews with him, and I fell in love with this author. I think for a lot of teachers' assistants or teachers' aides, one thing that your students are struggling with, and a lot of the feedback I got from the first workshop, is just getting them engaged in books, engaged in texts that they would like. And author studies can really be that way to engage students. Stephen Lane, who is a researcher on reading aloud, at a recent PD I attended, mentioned that good readers or literate people will know their favourite authors. Think about it, you know, we walk into a bookshop and we say, oh, that's by J.K. Rowling, or, oh, that's the new one by John Grisham. You know, we know the authors we like to read. So this is a literate person in society. So what we need to be mindful of is that we want to actually create that in our students. We don't want to just introduce books to students, but we want to introduce a range of authors from a range of genres. You know, we want to let them have a taste of all the different types of texts they could be reading: adventure and fantasy, maybe a bit of romance, maybe one of those pony pal books, Minecraft, all those things that kids like, but a diverse range of it. And by teaching these students that these books are written by authors and they have names and they're like, you know, there's other books by that author, it actually is developing them into literate people. So this skill also develops student skills in reading and writing. There's a reading strategy called Read Like an Author, where you have students trying to kind of get into an author's head. They start to question the text they're reading and think, why did the author write that? Or how is that different from the other books the author's written? It makes them infer what knowledge is there, and the choices that the author has and hasn't made, and why they have made that or why they haven't. In the same way, we can write like an author. So writing skills can be learnt from an author's writing style. So you look at the way an author structures a text and you can emulate it. I love using Roald Dahl for author studies, and I've often used Fantastic Mr. Fox then when we've been talking about how to introduce a setting. And we can pattern our setting writing off the way that Roald Dahl does. So I explained how he introduces this, this character, Mr. Fox, to the reader. In chapter 2, he says, on a hill above the valley there was a wood. In the wood there was a huge tree. Under the tree there was a hole. And in that hole lived Mr. Fox and Mrs. Fox and their 4 small foxes. And so patterned writing can occur from that. I can then say to the students, well, now, you know, think about your characters. how would you describe their setting? And you can actually pattern your writing off the way Roald Dahl does. So then it might be, in a city, there was a house. In that house, there was some stairs, and under that stairs, there lived a mouse and his 5 mouse brothers. So patterned writing can really be a way in to writing for a lot of students, and that can come from the authors that they're reading and patterning it off the authors they're reading. So the steps here are that, firstly, if you're working one-on-one with a student, or even in a group, it's good to talk to the students firstly about what their interests are. Find out what things they like, and this might not necessarily be books. If they're a disengaged reader, it might be things they enjoy doing on the weekend. It might be games they like to play. And you'd be surprised at the books that are coming out now, the authors that are writing books around students' interests, and that can actually be the way into an author study. So, for example, you might have students who are pretty funny, like, they love to have a chat, but they also love to have a laugh. Well, you could think of a comedy author for an author study, and that might be like Andy Griffiths, for example. If you have a student who's really interested in fantasy and they're playing all these fantasy computer games, or they just love dragons, you might look at Emily Rodda, and that might be the author study. So you could talk about their interests, or you could look at the books that they're enjoying already and almost do a reverse investigation where you go, oh, did you know that this book is by this author? Let's go and find some of their other books. I've done this with Stephen Michael King when I've been reading the book Map Dog, and students, and sometimes if I bring in another book of his, they notice that the illustrations are similar, and especially if I say to them, oh look, the illustrations are similar, and then we start talking about, oh, how the writing style's quite similar. Oh, both these books are by Stephen Michael King. Let's go find some more of his books. And so it almost becomes an author study quite organically. If you're having trouble finding authors that you think would suit your students, the easiest thing is to Google Australian authors. There are so many great Australian authors out there like now, but looking at the Children's Book Council of Australia website and noticing the award-winning authors can be really useful. Also Reading Australia, which is another website that I mentioned in the first workshop, looking at some of the authors there, and I think there's actually a search function in Reading Australia where you can search for authors. Or even better, and if you have one, talk to your librarian, or make me your phone a librarian for the evening. Librarians also, a wealth of information around authors that are good, authors that are upcoming, and authors that might suit students with a particular interest. Secondly, the next step is to collect as many of this author's books as you can. You've got to get your greasy mitts on them and your kids' mitts on them. It's important to make those books then really available for your students to read, no matter how you do this. I know a teacher who's working in quite a remote, I should say, New South Wales school. It's a brand new school. There is no library, let alone a librarian. So for her to actually physically get copies of books is quite a drama. But what New South Wales libraries, and I know ACT libraries and libraries around the country have now, are online collections, and I'm talking about the state libraries. So you can actually borrow books online, or the digital versions, and you can share them with your students. So talking to this teacher, that was a way that we problem solved her situation. Being able to find these books digitally, it'll still give the students a taste of that author. Yes, in a different sphere, and it will stop her from having to spend lots of money to buy all their books herself. I would make sure that, it's up to you then how you introduce these books to the students, and you could really read them quite methodically. You might read one at a time, or you might just sample parts of the books, but make these books really available to your students. Perhaps having a shared reading box, or just a box, in the classroom where you're working with that student, or in the room where you're working, and having the author's books there for the student to just go and grab and have a look at when they want to. When I've done author studies with shorter books, but still with upper grades, so Graham-based picture books, which are really meant for senior primary anyhow, I was reading the whole book as the author study. Whereas when I was doing Jackie French, who writes quite long books, we were just taking a sample. And these samples, or the whole books that I was using, this was what we used for our shared reading. It was what I used when I was reading aloud. It was what I used when I talked about different grammar elements. So, if we're looking at nouns or processes, we're looking at them in that text. And it was what we would use for spelling lessons when we were highlighting interesting words or words that we wanted to work on, or great vocabulary. We'd use the text. So we need these books available so that they can be used for all those literacy activities. The third step is that it's a great idea to discover more about the author. You want to get the student to remember the author's name. And so how you do this is up to you. It could just be through some research, or even just as you read the book and making sure you say, and this book is written by Roald Dahl. And this book is written by Roald Dahl. And so even just doing that, it could be creating something from what you've learned about the author. Interviews with authors, or even pretend or mock ones, are a great way to discover more about authors and can help students to get inside an author's head. I'm going to show you where you can access some author interviews. These ones are mostly for upper primary and lower senior, but there are lots of authors have interviews on their publishers' websites as well. I always share the story of an author. When I read My Dog, I share that Stephen Michael King actually had a dog that was all mutty and scruffy, and he found him on the streets. And that is one way for me to get students to remember that author's story with the book, but also who that author was. So it's really by discovering more about these authors, we're getting that author's name into our students' heads so they can remember them. My other hint is that if you can't find author interviews, make them up. And I've had lots of fun pretending to be Morris Kleitzman just by putting on a hat and a different t-shirt. I've had another teacher pretend to be Roald Dahl and entertain my class by coming in. This might be a suggestion that you say to the classroom teacher, hey, I thought that we could do maybe an author study and you could dress up as Roald Dahl, and you come. So, even making it up, that can be a memorable event to help students remember that author's name. The fourth step here is to compile some information about the author. So I like to complete almost a summary sheet at the end of each author study, where we'd write about what the author's style was, what we enjoyed as a class about their writing, some of their books, and then we'd display these in the class. But you could as easily do this in a student's reading journal. You could easily do this as bookmarks. You might get the students to do little book reviews, or even do a digital digital creation around the book. They might draw a part of the book, or even just talk to you about it, and you might record what the student thought about that author. Just some kind of record keeping, really. So for each strategy, I said that we'd have a little activity. So our activity, our first one, is to actually have a listen to an author, Gary Crew, explain his writing process. And I'm doing this because I want you to see how, by listening to authors talk about their writing process, it can actually teach us about writing. So an author study doesn't just have to be about the text that you're working with. It can actually teach us skills about text creation. So let's just swap the screen. Where are we going? To this one. And we're just going to go, so this website that we're going to is abcnet.au, and you'll get a link of this as well as a follow-up email if you are interested. On this website, they actually have a few different authors, mostly for senior, as I said, but there are some primary authors in here as well, sharing about their text creation. So just bear that in mind, that this interview is actually pitched more for senior school. He's talking about his writing process here as well. So we're just going to listen for a little bit, and then I'm going to get you to tell me what you notice about his writing process.
A fountain pen.
True.
Why do you still do that?
I truly
So I'm just going to check that the sound's on for you because I don't think, oh yes it is. Excellent. Okay.
I do believe, and I teach my students this, and all my students die, they have a heart attack. So at the moment I'm working on a novel called, a subject called Writing Your Novel. So all these young, fresh, young things came in. I gave each one of them a journal. I bought down the road at the local, trading post.
Yeah.
I gave each one of them a 2B pencil and an eraser. I said, this is what we're writing on this semester. And they all went, literally, there's a generation that actually can't handwrite. They actually can't write by hand. But I believe that I've got several computers. If I'm travel or whatever, I use different one. Of course I do. It's fabulous, great thing. But I believe there is a connection between, like, the brain going down the arm and through the hand and through the pencil or through the pen, which is more intimate contact with the page than your fingers on a keyboard looking at a grey screen. I don't get turned on by looking at a piece of a touch screen. It doesn't excite me at all. I do get turned on by looking at lined paper and thinking I can fill that with my personal human marks. And I think it's kind of like the cave person in me who wants to make smudges on walls.
I'm just going to stop it there. So just reflect and feel free to share in the chat or using the mic what listening to Gary Crew talking about his writing process kind of makes you think about for writing.
I guess the biggest thing, this is Geraldine speaking, the biggest thing was obviously the fact that children are drawing more and more away from actually writing. So it's not just trying to get them engaged in reading a book, it's actually then trying to get them to write about it, which can be a bit of a double whammy. So going back to what you said earlier on about the swapping, how the process of looking for a book, you actually tap into what their passion is, and then you can sort of start looking for books that include things that they're passionate about.
Yep.
Work on it that way, and then it's easier to get them to perhaps write about it.
Yep.
And research it that way.
Thanks, Geraldine. Anyone else have any anything that struck them about what Gary Crew said about his approach to writing?
Just with handwriting, it is more, you don't have to stop and think about where the letters are on the keyboard and lose your train of thought, especially when they're just learning about that skill as well. Yeah. So handwriting allows more free-form ideas, I guess. They don't get stopped along the way. Because some of the kids, they'll start doing something and then they've forgotten their train of thought. And then sort of try and help them find back where they were.
That's it. And there's so many roadblocks to creating text anyhow. I think that's really good insight that that actually by using the pen, that sometimes that takes away a roadblock and allowing. I think something that strikes me every time I hear this clip is that there is a generation of students that can't handwrite. And Gary Crew is talking as a literacy professor. So he's working in a university. So there's a generation going through university already that can't handwrite. So what does that say about the generation that we're teaching, that we have in the classrooms every day? So listening to Gary Crew, like it tells me a lot about students writing and how important it is to just give them pen and paper to write. But it also makes me think about him as a writer. Every time I hear that, I think, wow, he has sat down and he has not sat at his computer and typed up these novels that he's written. And if you've read any of his books, they're all quite long, like they're not a few lines. He has sat there and laboured over it with pen and paper. To me, that makes it so much more memorable and meaningful to then read his books. I can read them now with this knowledge about what this writer does to create these.
I can add also there, Libby, that one of the things that I've perhaps done with the younger kiddies is to actually scribe their thoughts for them.
Yeah.
And then they can actually write them up themselves. And that way you're maintaining that sort of that flow for them, or you're giving them that freedom to actually express their thoughts and feelings without having about describing it themselves.
Yeah.
Where we are, I was going to say where we are. I mean, the kids actually use laptops, and they've got the voice that they can actually record their voice, and it will type it up for them. But they've also got the voice record where they can then perhaps look at writing as well.
And the kids are using that more and more as well. But I think to keep that connection between words and written text is so important. So scribing, definitely a great way to do it. All right, we're going to keep
add something.
Sorry. Yes.
In Tasmania, we've been mucking around a little bit with drawing before writing. So
yes.
getting the pictures and then maybe a bit of labels so that the tricky words are scribed for them, and then that supports writing.
And that's so true, Sally. And actually, I think that ties in a little bit to what Gary Crew was saying about that caveman feeling in us, that actually to create a piece of text, it might start as images, it might start as some kind of strange scribble, but it has meaning of a sense. It mightn't be that I can read the meaning, but there is meaning there that student wants to get across.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, we're going to keep moving on. The next strategy we're going to look at is modelled writing. And this is explained on page 38. So modelled writing is a really beautiful strategy. If you're not familiar with it, it is the absolute gold in teaching written language as well. So in the first workshop, I spoke about shared writing. Now, shared writing is a part of a gradual release of responsibility model, which means basically I do it, then we do it, then you do it. And you can teach anything through gradual release of responsibility, but writing is one of those things that we often teach through this model. So modelled writing is actually that first step. It's the I do. And it's so important that we get this first step right. It's a very planned strategy, even though it might be presented as quite ad hoc. When you're modelling writing, you need to be really mindful before you even begin of what you want to focus on while you do this. So you need to think of what your goal will be when you're teaching this modelled writing episode. Is it punctuation? Is it going to be spelling? Is it going to be maybe a grammatical element? So I want them to use adjectives. Is it going to be something to do with text structure as a whole, like paragraphing? Whatever you choose, you need to let your think alouds, which I'll get to in a moment, be really focused around this. I read this really interesting article about educators who weren't planned in their modelled writing episodes, and it found that most teachers would actually revert to focusing on spelling and punctuation during their think alouds as they're talking through their writing, even if that wasn't their goal, even if that wasn't their focus. And that actually distracts students completely from what they should be focusing on in the modelled writing episode. I have seen myself do it. I've seen other educators do it, and I'm sure that you probably have as well. So step 0 before step 1 is to decide on what your goal will be. And I'd take your goal for your modelled writing from where your students are at. What do they need to work on in their writing? So then step 1 is to select your text type. You choose text type that will help you to portray your goal. So for example, I use narrative, and that helped me to model concise planning to my students. My goal was to teach them concise planning. I modeled to them how to construct a story map, which we'll talk about later, and then how that would translate into a story. And I did that because I noticed that a lot of my students had trouble planning ahead in their writing. They were so keen to get started that they often wouldn't think about how they would end. So that goal I could have used really with many, many different text types, because we have to plan really with any kind of text we write. But narrative was something my students were already really familiar with and something they were working on, so I used narrative. Step 2 is to start by explaining what you're writing, and you need to be really clear here. And so it might feel a bit awkward, particularly if you're doing it one-on-one, but it's really necessary. So the first few times as well, you need to explain what your goal is as well. So, for example, today I'm going to write a story and I'm going to focus on planning a well-structured story. And if you want to get a gold star, write this down as well and make this like a learning intention or learning goal. Your school might use the learning intention kind of phrasing, but basically a learning goal. Then, once you have finished your modelled writing, if you've written this down, your students can tell you if you achieved that goal. And when they go to write, they can tell you if they achieved that goal. And these learning intentions and this idea is from John Hattie as well. So share as well when you're beginning who you are writing for. And the first few times, be really clear why it matters. So don't just say, oh, I'm writing for the teacher. Explain why it matters. I'm writing for the teacher, so it has to be clear. My writing has to be clear so she can understand. I'm writing for preschoolers, so my vocab shouldn't be too complex. I should use quite simple vocabulary. I'm writing to send this to our education minister, so my writing needs to show a depth of vocabulary and be quite formal. So explain it and vary who you're writing for each time as well. The third step is then, after explaining what you'll be writing about, you need to begin writing. And as you do this, you need to talk about what you're thinking. And these think alouds are the gold of modelled writing. So be prepared here with what you want to say. To begin with, I actually, and I still sometimes do, I have my points on a post-it note, not really in detail, but just the one or two things that I know when I want to stop and I want to say this, and it shouldn't take you very long, like it should only take a minute or two just to jot it down. Okay, these are my goals, what I'm going to say and when. And if I have that post-it note, then it kind of keeps you on track as to what I'm going to say and when. So, say if my goal was for my students to write more engaging beginnings to their stories, my think alouds would sound a little bit like this. Okay, so I've already planned my story, but to begin, I need a way to engage my reader or to hook them in. I know the first few words of my story are going to be the most important, so rather than starting with once upon a time, which is very used, I'm going to start with some action. I'm going to get straight to the complication of my story, then I'm going to slowly reveal the rest of this in the introduction. So to begin with, I'm going to write, bam, the train came off the tracks with a jolt. So you can see how that think aloud really reveals to the students what my hidden reasons are and my thinking behind my writing choices. And your goal is for your students to internalise this. So you don't need to be talking the entire time that you're writing. Often I do the talking and then I do the writing, as you just saw. You might say the words as you're writing them down, or you might do that silently. But the main thing is to talk about what you're thinking as you're writing. The fourth step talks about continuing the text and then developing this lesson almost into a joint construction where the student joins in and participates. They might grab a pen as well and help you finish off the text. You can then use this text to then show editing skills, which if spelling and punctuation wasn't your focus at the goal, you can actually still come back to it at this point in the strategy. I would advise though that you don't need to complete a whole text with your students. It would be way too much teacher talk if we did this. And seeing that the adults are the ones doing all the talking in the classrooms anyhow, it's good just to complete the parts of the text that will serve your purpose. So allow the student to then practice with you and then give them time to use that language focus in their own writing. You can always come back to the writing, the same piece of writing that you've started, and maybe have another goal in mind at a different time. And depending on the year group will depend on how long you can really engage a student in a modelled writing episode. But really, like 5 to 15 minutes is long enough for any student to be listening to just your voice at a time. So, my little activity for this strategy, but also if you have questions about this strategy, now's a great time to ask, is I want you to imagine that you're going to now model the writing of a crime story with a student. What would be your goal? Maybe it's for the students that you're working with. What would be your goal for a modelled writing episode? And then if that was your goal, what might be one thing that you'd say as a think aloud? Again, feel free to share it on the chat, or you can use your microphones. What would be a goal for some of the students that you're working with in their writing?
Working out what sort of a crime it would be.
Working out what the, sorry?
What sort of a crime it would be.
Oh, okay, yes.
So
So they're
doing to make the crime, to have it a crime.
Yeah.
Plan
So,
plan the crime.
Yeah, so planning the crime. So your think aloud might be something like, I know that before I start writing, I have to plan what the crime will be. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Louise.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have any ideas there?
I was wondering about different sentence beginnings. So to
Yes.
model, you know, on the weekend, well, how else could we say what we did on the week? You know,
Yes.
trying to talk through.
Yeah.
That might have been my standard, but how do I change it?
Yeah, so you might say as a think aloud, I know that every time I write my recount, I start with on the weekend. This time I'm going to change it up to make it more exciting to the reader. I'm going to start with blah, 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 blah. Like,
The sun was shining.
Yeah. So you almost take that student's goal, but you relate it to yourself, what you want them to be thinking. Because really our goal through these think alouds is for our think alouds to become the students' actual thinking, for it to become their internal monologue while they go to write them.
I guess getting back to what Louise suggested about planning, when it's a sort of narrative, the theme is generally the what, where, when, who, and why. And then you give them those headings, and it gives them a little bit of structure. And a head start as to, you know, the sort of things they're going to need to include in their story to give it some form. And then they can start, once, you know, they've established those ideas, they can start up-leveling their thinking around the story, I guess. And
yeah. So being really structured in what you'd say as a think aloud there, you might say something like, I'm going to think now through these headings as I plan my story. And that would actually be a model writing episode. So rather than just giving them to the student straight away, you might talk about, well, I'm going to now do this, and then we're going to do it together. Perfect. All right, let's move on. So now we're going to look at feature lists, and these are explained on page 20, but also, well, the written feature list is explained on page 20. And then visual text feature list is explained on page 70 and 71. Oh, great. So I think aloud there as well from our lovely group talking about how they'd make it interesting to draw a reader in. Just in the chat there about talking about, you know, my opening would be this, blah, 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 and this would make it interesting to draw the reader in. And that last sentence you've written there, that's your think about, and that's the actual goal, telling the kids what you're thinking as you're creating that writing. It does feel a bit awkward to start with, but as you do it more and more, yeah, you start to talk to yourself a lot more as you do your writing. Okay, so feature lists are split up in the books between visual and written feature lists. Feel free to flip to whichever one suits you better. I have put them together because so many of our texts nowadays actually include visual and written text. So I think both of these are really important. Feature lists are one of those strategies that once you learn how to use them, it'll be second nature to use these strategies when talking to students about writing or creating. And it might be that you do this in a group or one-on-one with students. You can do feature lists in both places. It's also a stepping stone in being able to critically analyse text. So if you remember that first workshop that we did when we critically analysed those images of that image of a teacher assistant working with a teacher, well, doing a feature list is actually our step one before we do that. We look at what are the features of this text first. So in that way, feature lists actually really help reading and comprehension as well as writing. I've used this strategy a lot over the years. The steps here are that firstly we select a text. So I know that a lot of you would be kind of constrained as to what text your students are working with, but if you do have freedom in getting to choose what text you're going to use with your students when you're looking at feature lists, then I'd suggest to think outside the box, because standardised testing, NAPLAN, has got us thinking about only a handful of text types, narrative, persuasive, but actually teaching to just these text types takes a genre approach to the extreme. That approach actually asks us to look at all the texts around the world and find the distinguishing features that they have and match them to other similar texts. So some of the text types that I've taught have been really planned. You know, I have used narrative, I have used information report, I have used persuasive ads, but some have also come from student inquiry. So we were watching an episode of War on Waste by, I think it's Daniel Rudcastle, a few years ago that this series was on TV. And during the episode, he was talking about plastic bags and the Ban the Bag campaign. And he said to the viewers, you should write letters to your state minister telling them to ban the plastic bag. And so my students at this time were like, yeah, we want to do this. Let's write letters. So letter writing actually became our text type. You know, we could look at how letters are structured. And really then in the end, because we realised that it's quite hard to send letters to your minister, it actually became how to write a formal email as our end goal. So think outside the box. You could use really anything as a text type. The second step is that when you collect examples, the aim here is to get a range of the text type that demonstrate the similarities and also sometimes the differences between them. You want, firstly, for students to be able to notice the commonalities. So you might be looking at picture books and you go, oh, look, they've all got titles. You might want to collect examples of the text that are quite, if it's quite a specific text, but it also adds an element to the investigation if you allow students to do this as well. So, you know, you might talk about, okay, well, we're going to look at newspaper articles. Can you bring one in from home? Whatever you do though, make the examples that you're going to use authentic. And I've said this to the teachers as well. If you are writing procedures, don't spend your precious time writing these procedures yourself. Don't do it, because you can find them everywhere. You know, you find these procedures in cookbooks, on building websites, on the back of frozen food packets, you know, for Lego. That's a procedure. Find authentic texts that show this text type that you're using. And, you know, if the people that you're working with don't do this, don't feel that you can't. You know, if you're working in a class and they're working on information reports and they haven't opened up, you know, a book on armadillos from the library, we'll take it in. That's also an information report. Let's see how this is structured. Because we want to give our students authentic texts, real world texts, because our students will one day be writers for the world. They won't just be writers for school. So when doing feature lists on things like persuasive ads, I found a whole heap of these, and I actually brought them in to show students. And this is one example of one, and it had the image and it had the words on it. So it was kind of guided. I gave them an idea of what kind of a text it should look like. but also giving students non-examples can sometimes give them kind of some thinking space. So I was looking at picture books with my students, and then I brought in The Very Stinky Cheese Man. If you haven't seen this book, it's great, but it is a postmodern picture book. So instead of it being like a linear story, the story actually loops back around itself. You've got a narrator that keeps talking to the audience. You've got stories that have like half endings. So it's a really crazy picture book. It made the students, by bringing this non-example that wasn't a normal picture book, it made the students really question, well, what makes a picture book? It made them refine what they thought would have to go in that kind of a text. So I feel that so in that, I'd say bring in examples, but also non-examples, or examples a bit different from normal. I feel like the third step, which is to create a chart that notes all the features, is the step that we're most likely to miss. You know, we're happy to talk about text and what are in them, but actually making these charts or these visuals and representing them for students in a way that they'll remember it, that is the important part here. That's where we want students to be heading to, so they can replicate these texts in their own writing. What I've learned about these charts is that they need to be memorable. And I know that teachers' assistants are great at making memorable resources. So here's an example of a narrow burger. And the narrow burger is a chart of feature list that I made around narratives. I got the idea from someone else, but then I adapted it with my own class's input. And it was all about, you know, that narratives almost are put together like a burger. We have our orientation, our lettuce on top, who, what, when. We've got our complication or the meat of the burger. We've got our resolution or this cheese that kind of melts in and draws all the yummy parts together. And so there are lots of different ways that you can talk about a burger as a metaphor for a narrative, but having it there and making those parts really memorable is definitely something that worked. I also used the recount roller coaster, and we had the different parts of a recount as the different carriages on a roller coaster. We've had procedure pancakes, and the different parts are the different parts of a pancake stack, you know, the ice cream or the maple syrup, and then the pancakes. Whatever you do, you know, make it a bit of fun when you are making your visual representation, because it can be the thing that then sticks to the students when they go to think about that text type at another time. And finally, and very obviously, a feature list should end with students creating their own text. So students should then be able to look at that feature list and refer to it as they make their text, ensuring they have similar features in the text they're creating. Here are some examples of some other feature lists of type. So on the right, we've got in information report ice cream. This one's a little bit more detailed than what the narrow burger was. You can see that it's for a different year group. Here, again, it's talking about what the parts of an information report include, but also we've got some language features, and we put these down the cone that like technical terms would be there, or a glossary. It would be in paragraphs. So when you're thinking about feature lists, it doesn't just have to be the parts of text, it can also be broken up into some general features that you find in that text. On the left, I've got two examples of success criteria. Another great way to do feature lists, and I think really helpful as well if you're working one-on-one with students or in small groups, because this is a feature list, but also something that you can put in students, you know, writing journals or workbooks, and they can actually be working through as they're writing to see that they're including each feature. So you can see, again, different year levels here, upper and more junior, but for each part of the text, we've got the features there written down. And these weren't things that I as a teacher went away and created. I actually created these with the students. So we were sitting there writing this down, putting this into the document as the students were telling me what they noticed about the text, what features it had. So you can see there as well that there's vocabulary and punctuation there as well to show us, you know, what other features would we find in those texts. I'm going to talk about success criteria later as well when we talk about editing practice. Okay, so now for our little activity on feature lists, I'm going to get you to think about if you were to write a feature list, say that your job is to create a new school website. So your text is school websites. I'm going to give you a list of some school websites, and I want you to either write in the chat or share using the mic any features that you notice. I'm putting the links in the chat now, so you can click on them. I'd suggest opening them all up. Again, notice what's similar between them and then share that with everyone. What's something that you notice that's similar in all school websites? What would go on a feature list for school websites? Feel free to pop it in the chat, or you can share using your mic. When you notice something that you might notice a similarity even just between two of them.
The school's emblem, the school's crest.
Yep. So you all have an emblem, yep. So if I was to make a school website, I'd need to make sure that I had a school emblem. Happy children, yes.
Yeah, that's what I noticed.
So true, yeah, that's right. It's like, you know, these kids are all smiling. None of them are hiding under desks.
Some of them are being very creative. They've got paint on their hands or something on their hands, Play-Doh or something.
Yeah. So they're like kind of engaged in learning.
Yeah.
There's links about the schools.
There's links to do with the school, that's right. So there's links on information about the school. Are there any particular types of information about the school that we need to include?
Contact details.
Yeah, contact details is on all of them. So, you know, if I was to create a website, a school website, I need to make sure I had contact details. Do you have an idea already of who the audience is for these school websites? Who are they trying to get to look at these? Parents, yeah. So, you know, they're all persuasive texts, aren't they? They're all trying to persuade parents to send their kids to these schools. Multicultural promotion, yeah. So they're trying to show that everyone is welcome, kind of thing. So that I guess again, for persuasion, they want everyone to feel that they're welcome at their schools. Open days, information about open days on them. You've all got search bars of some type. So if you want to find more information, you could then go on to do some critical analysis of this and talk about how, you know, what effect does it have on us that the students are looking straight at us. You could start talking then about like, oh, it doesn't look like any teacher assistants are featured, or there might be very few teachers even featured on these school websites. I wonder why that is. So you could go in then to do critical analysis. But that beginning step, which you guys just nailed, is just telling, noticing what's similar about them, what's similar about this text type. If I was to go and make one of these, what I'd need to know, what parts I'd need to include. If anyone
the children in the orange public school one are so far away you can't really tell if they're happy or not.
I don't think there are. Oh yes, I don't think there are any in that. I think it's just a picture.
But I think so far away, it's concentrating on the building, not the children.
Yeah. And, you know, in that as well, you could talk about that as a non-example, as, oh, okay, so we said they all have to have children, but this one doesn't have children. What does it have? And the groups SMMH have, you know, said there as well about the impressive grounds in the building. Yeah, so this school, instead of publicising the children, they're trying to say, look at our ground, look at our buildings. And I think a few of the others do a similar thing. They have a scrolling header, and some of their headers actually have pictures of the buildings. Another way to persuade there. Okay, ready to move on? We're going to move on to the next part, which called Taking a Different Tact. So during the first workshop, I spoke about guided reading and writing conferences. If you haven't read about those, I'd suggest that you go and have a read of these in your book. The next two strategies that we'll look at focus on developing the same outcome. So focus on developing reading and writing skills, but they use slightly different means to get there. It doesn't mean that they're replacements to the other strategies. They actually work really well to complement them, but they will suit certain students better than others as well. So we're going to go to shared reading now, which is on page 56 and 57. I talked a lot about read alouds in the first workshop, and shared reading is kind of the follow-on from this as well. So write read alouds if you want to you know, compare what you have to do between shared reading and a read aloud. There are some slight differences. So when I think of shared reading, I think of hot reads. And after seeing Stephen Lane, who I mentioned previously, he's really the king of the read aloud. And he talked about hot reads when I saw him present, about how you'd sell a book to your students. You know, you'd explain how wonderful it is, and then you'd read it and you'd almost perform it, and the class would just be so wrapped up in the book. So I decided that I really wanted to promote books in this way in my class. And I decided that I was going to grab a book and I was going to read it to my class every day. I was going to read the same one every day for a week. And I was so surprised that my students actually liked this. They were in year 2 at the time, and I thought that they would get bored with the same text day after day after day. I did choose a picture book as well. But actually what I found is that after a day or 2 of me reading the same text, the kids would actually join in the reading. And this is what shared reading really is. It's taking that strategy of read alouds to the next level, as I said, by sharing the story with student or group of students more than once. They're able to internalize it and they can read it with you. So all the strategy hints and tips that I spoke about when I talked about read alouds also apply here. And those briefly were that you choose something that you love, you know, choose something that you're passionate about. You rehearse it, so you practice it. You introduce it in some way so that students have some background knowledge around it. That you add some expression when you read it, you add some passion to it, and that finally you allow students to respond. So these steps are actually the same as the first 4 steps of a read aloud. But there are a few additional steps here. And that is to reread and reread and reread. And each time that you do this, you allow the students to join in with the reading. You don't go, shh, my turn. You actually let them read with you. Now that might mean that you need to slow your pace. It might mean that you have a signal. You might need to be really structured with some students and say, I'm going to read a page and then you're going to read the next one, which is a perfect way to do it one-on-one. But I find that even if I'm silent and I'm working one-on-one with a student doing shared reading, if I'm silent for long enough, they sometimes just chime in, especially if I've read the book to them already or reread it a few times with them. They'll be able to chime in and read along. It's a perfect way to teach different reading strategies and or some different ways of focusing on parts of text. And these are actually listed on both pages in the book as well. However, I think it also assists students to internalize a story structure, and it enhances their vocabulary by exposing them to a range of language. It really does develop that read aloud strategy. I shared the story of how I read The Magic Hat to a group of ELAD kinder students during the first workshop. So this group, for those that are new with us this evening, they were mostly non-readers, or pre-readers, I should say. I read that book with that student every day, and slowly they joined in. And after a week, they were reading this book to me. And shared reading really allowed these students to internalise this story, and from that we were able to innovate on the text. We made a story map, and we could understand that language structure of narratives. I also read The Magic Hat with my son, who's 3, and we read it over and over again. He knows this story so well that I've seen shared reading in my own personal life. So if I stop reading a page of The Magic Hat, then you hear this little 3-year-old voice, start reading the next page. So you'd see shared reading in your personal life, but translating this into the classroom can be so powerful. These students, they're developing their language, they're developing their reading in a very scaffolded way. So, because shared reading, just like read aloud, just like a lot of the strategies, it's necessary that we have some texts to be able to read. So I think what a nice strategy is, a nice activity for us to do now is to share what one of your favourite read alouds is. You can type this into the chat if you like, or you can share it on the mic. If people are going to share on the mic, I'd suggest everyone else grab a sheet of paper and write down some other people's favourite read alouds, because then you've got this lovely list of read alouds that you can take into the classroom next time you go to read aloud to a student and do some shared reading with them. I can just see that you've shared that you've got the ALEA project at your schools, Sue, Martina, Mari and Helen. Could you explain what that is to us? Well, oh, thank you, Sally's. Oh, Harry McClary, yes, such a great read aloud. Oh my gosh, I love it. Wombat Stew, yes, Michelle. Oh, Michelle's another beautiful one. Any other favourite text to read aloud? I know we've all got favourites. What is the text that you love to read aloud or to share reading with?
Where I am with boys, it doesn't matter what age
yes.
they are. Called Billy the Punk.
Oh my gosh, I love Billy the Punk. I love it. Such a great book. Such a great book. And because it's from quite a few years ago now, if you find a copy of Billy the Punk, do not get rid of it. Like, hold on to that book.
Well, yes, that's what happened. The library had got rid of it, and so I'll have it. So I'll
yes,
put it in.
That's exactly it. Because they're starting to get weeded from libraries down. I'm pretty sure that there won't be another reprint of that book. So, yeah, I love that book. Beautiful book. Pete the Cat. Great, thanks, Sally. Possum in the House. That is another great one, please. Thank you. Wow, what a great list of books. My son has just started listening to The Magic Faraway Tree. We've been reading that every night. That's another wonderful read aloud. And if you have students who are slightly older, another great way of doing shared reading with a longer text like that is, that you might do the one chapter a few times. That might be the way you do it. Tashi series, yes, Tashi as well. Again, with Tashi, it might be that you read the same chapter a few times if that's going to be your shared reading, which is totally fine. And, I think about, as someone who's an established reader, oh, that sounds really boring. But actually, kids love repetition. And so sometimes repeating what that's not my, yes. I'm reading then to my daughter at the moment, Kerry. That's not my pony. Its tail is too tufty. But also great for beginning readers because they can see the pattern there in the text. Are we there yet, Pony Pals? Look at all these great texts. Thank you so much for sharing your favourite read alouds. Feel free to keep sharing them if you have any more. I'll just go back to Sue, Martina, Mari and Helen's comment. Did you want to just explain what the ALEA project is at your school? Yep.
We were starting to type, but it was getting too long.
Well, I was going to say, you might be typing.
Yeah, I was. But basically, it's a project that started through the Brisbane Catholic Education Department. and come to our school, and all the teachers have been given, you know, proper education about it. And basically, texts are chosen and read and reread for approximately a week, say. Then all activities are based around that text. So, you know, it might be spelling, it might be sight words, it might be drawing pictures, you know, the list goes on and on and on. So that's one part of it. But also another part is, well, I work in prep, and with regard to like books the children read in prep, so for guided reading, the text that they read that week also is read with the buddy class when they come to visit.
Yes. Oh, how lovely.
And is also sent home for homework reading over the week. So it's sort of constantly reinforced. So that's sort of the basic crux of it. Yeah.
Yes. And that is
the spelling, they've used the ending sounds so that they can use those in other words, so that children can see that the sound on the end makes the same sound all the way through words.
And do you know that you've actually jumped ahead for us? I'll let you run that part of the session. But that is, but that is exactly what this professional learning is about. So you ladies come to this professional learning with such a wealth of knowledge as well, because you've seen this enacted in a classroom, which is awesome, of how you can use that text throughout all your activities, and totally, you know, the shared reading is a big part of that. Thank you for letting me know about that project. We're in you know, every state's in their own little bubble, and I hadn't actually heard of that. So that's a fantastic project to have happening with you guys. Thank you for sharing that with us.
No worries.
Thank you. So now we're going to move on to editing practice, which is on page 17 of the book. I talked in that first workshop about conferencing with students as a way of developing their writing. Well, editing practice is another way that we can develop students' writing skills. So this one fits in really well with the process writing approach, which some of you might be familiar with. But basically, this approach talks about students kind of working independently through a cycle of writing. And during it, students are kind of expected, or mostly expected, to edit their own work and also edit peers' work. Every teacher does this slightly differently though. So it's a process writing approach kind of is meant to replicate what authentic writers do in the real world. So, you know, they pre-write, they think about what they're going to write, they might jot down some ideas or get some pictures together of things that inspire them, and then they write a draft, and then they need to revise it, and then they need to edit it, and then they publish. And this, you know, this writing cycle gets changed depending on the teacher. So in my classroom, it often looks like this, and I would actually pull apart the partner check, which would be a partner edit and a self-edit there. So, so it's self-check and partner check, and then they'd go into editing after that. So depending on how the teacher does it, they might pull apart that editing part in a different way. But editing practice is really necessary to do before we allow, or before we expect students to be able to self-edit their work. And it's something that I do with students, no matter what year group they're in, even in very early years. So I ensure my students have completed some editing practice. It is a skill that does need to be taught, and I'd highly encourage you to do it with the kids that you're working with if you haven't yet. It doesn't take very long either, if you're talking about a strategy and how long it takes as far as your day is concerned. The first step is to provide a text with some errors. So here you can use one of those student texts that they are creating, or you might say, here's one that I prepared earlier, or it might be even that you use that text that you were using for modelled writing, that you modelled your writing through. You might have made some errors in it purposefully, and you might use that as your editing practice with a student. Editing practice is quite an individual strategy as well, so it's not something that we really guide students through. So then the next step, like everything else, is that we actually model and explain what we want to see happen, what an editor does. So you need to be specific here depending on what your expectations are for your students. I had someone in another workshop saying, oh, well, I think editors really should be talking about the writer's craft. I don't want an editor to have to look at full stops and capitals or spelling, but that might be your goal for your students. So depending on what your goal is, you need to explain what you'd want to see done in an edit. To formalise edits, I often give students that success criteria that I showed you before, and I'll show you some more examples of them in a moment. And this way students can work through the criteria that I've given them or that we've worked on together, and they can kind of tick these off as they go. During buddy edits, I generally expect students to be able to give each other one positive and one negative or constructive comment. And actually having that checklist or that success criteria with them can be really assistive here, because they can go through checking off the parts and actually picking up on some things that the student might have missed. Or you can do an even simpler version, which I've done a lot in junior years, is just to have goal cards, and that's all that they're working on when they're editing practice. So it might be that they're working on, reversing their B's, and that might be their editing practice, just around letter reversals. The book has a great general checklist for edits as well, but do make this specific to the students that you're working with and the language that you use with them. You might not say conjunctions, you might say things like, do you have joining words, in there? Or do you overuse joining words like and? So the third step here is that the students next need time to edit. So you've explained what you want to see them do during this editing practice, and then you give them some time to edit. Now, that shouldn't be really too long. If you're working with a group, it's sometimes good to only give a short time, because you know that your students are going to move at different paces. So I'd suggest that once maybe one or two of the students have finished, to stop the group, because I think it's better to have some editors still going than have many students just kind of, sitting there and waiting for others to finish. If you're doing this one-on-one though, you can, give that student as much time as needed to practice their editing. But don't be worried as well if, you've got time constraints, you have to stop them halfway through. They've had that editing practice. You've got an idea of how they've gone. The fourth step here is about marking the text together. And then this is really where we allow it to be kind of a collaborative activity. So we go, oh, I noticed that you found this in the text as an error. I found this, and kind of share with a partner as well. Or if you're working in groups, you can get the kids to share with a partner before you will edit the text together. So then you can go through and do a completed edit as well, what you'd say it would look like. Here are some examples of editing checklists or success criteria. These are kind of the goal cards that I was talking about. This is one that I used for senior school, where we were looking at different types of processes. And so the students, their goals or what they were looking at when they were editing was that they had inserted one of these. So, for some of my students, they'd take a doing card, and they were making sure they had doing or movement or action verbs in their writing. Here's one that students might tick off with basically a feature list. Have they got all those things in there as they're editing? Check it off. This is another way of doing it, showing them what where the student should be, what would be above, and what's below, and sometimes making that really clear. As here is something that, can you see that you've got this? Well, how do we move this writing up? How do we level it up? And here's another way of doing that. This is like a criteria checklist as well for editing, where we'd say, have they got a hook at the start of their ad? Well, they've got it. Yep, I can see it clearly there. They're doing this individually, remember? So there'd be some students that would go, oh, not quite, or not sure that I do, or some students can see, no, don't have it at all, not at all. And they might tick not at all. But then during that edit, they actually have the ability to move that tick and change their writing. So that's something that I found really useful with students as well, that when you've got several steps there to tick, not quite or not at all, got it, then the students can actually be thinking about how to move their writing up. We're going to look at a text by a student in a moment, and I want you to think about what you might suggest on an editing checklist if this was one of your students' texts, one of the students that you're working with, a text that they were writing. It can be anything. What would you suggest on a checklist if you wanted this student to develop their writing?
Punctuation.
Yeah. And we could even be really specific there and say using commas, you know, or, you know, you might want them to edit and you might want them to notice the different clauses in their writing. Beautiful. You can see that the student's already done some editing, so there'd be nothing wrong putting that on it as well. You know, you might have something like editing editing the names or editing the pronouns.
Looking at some of the, obviously the tricky words and ordinary.
Yeah, and you might have on the checklist that you just want them to underline spelling errors. Or it might be that this student has particular words, and so on their checklist, you're actually going to write down those particular words that they get stuck on every time, and they're going to check those off.
Yeah, and praise them for actually having, you know, attempted to spell that word. You know, they've got most of the, they've got the, you know, initial sound or the end sound and or phonemes, something special.
You could talk about complete sentences because they've got a full stop and then eating chocolate, so you might have complete sentences there. There's another goal. You can see how editing practice actually then assists you when you go to do conferencing as well with students. So when you then do the writing conference, you can focus more on a writer's craft because all those minor edits can be picked up by the self and peer editing. So you don't actually need to do it all when you sit down with a conference. You can focus on that one goal, again with the student, one thing that you want them to work on, because all these minor edits can be done beforehand if students learn this skill of editing, but a skill for life really. If you do want to share something, feel free to. I'm going to keep moving on. Okay. I finished the first workshop with a few kind of extras that you will hopefully find helpful in your everyday. And that's how I want to end our workshop as well. Even though I've still got a lot of time left, I do still have a lot planned for us. These are a few of my favourite strategies that I think can really be added into the work that you do as you need them. They might not be something that you see daily or even weekly. It might really depend on the kids that you work with. And we're going to start out with choral reading, which is explained on page 12. So I chose choral reading because I know that we're coming to a time in the year where there are lots of performances. You know, there are end-of-year concerts, there are graduations, there are different kinds of ceremonies at different schools. Choral reading is a performance strategy, it really is, and it can be so much fun. But more than that, it can actually develop students' awareness of text and their structure. You can also see how it will assist students' fluency because they learn that reading aloud is actually a thoughtful process in which you need to be able to tap into the rhythm and the pattern of a text. So it really is a group activity. So it suits better those who are working in groups of students than those working one-on-one, but it can be done in a pair. If you are working with students one-on-one and say that you're working, with students who are less confident readers, you might actually borrow some of the more confident readers and do a little group choral reading together. That might be one way that you work it. But I mean, really depends on your situation as well. It's up to you how you do this. It is a very collaborative strategy in which a group works together to develop their shared reading. So the steps here are that you need to select a text that will firstly be really easily divided into parts. Now, I would choose something that also has a bit of a rhythm or a pattern, which is suggested in the book. There are lots of text suggestions there as well, which are beautiful. I often use poetic texts. So the Natural Disaster series by Jackie French and Bruce Watley is one of my favourites. If you haven't seen this series, they've got fire, flood, I think it's tornado. No, that doesn't sound right. Cyclone. They've got cyclone, and there's another one. Beautiful books and very poetic and also very powerful. For something more lighthearted, I love Sister Madge's Book of Nuns because it also has a great rhythm and poetry to it. It is a strategy that lends itself to narrative because it's kind of enhances the telling of a story. The second step is to read the text to the students so that they can understand it, they can comprehend it, but they can also listen for any pattern or rhythm in it. So during this, you need to be able to tell the students, okay, I'm going to read, but I want you to listen with this intention that if we were to read this as a group, how could we make it come alive? In what parts would we all read? In what parts would some of us read? And then the third step is really when it becomes very collaborative. So here we have the students suggest ideas for the reading. We start generally with like, are there any parts that we should all read? And then we become more specific about who will read what and how they might read it. Have a system as well to mark this for the students. You know, even having the text on an enlarged sheet of paper or having it up on a smartboard or having it on a computer that you're working on with the students, highlighting and putting on notes and comments as you work through is useful. The fourth step is to rehearse. And even I'd suggest to record the reading. By recording your reading, you can actually get students to listen to it and then they can evaluate it and then they can decide how they're going to improve it. Because you do need to rehearse a choral reading a few times before you finally perform it. Choral reading is such a performance strategy, so it makes sense that it would be a strategy that you could use at a school assembly, but it also could be shared, say, on a school Facebook page or on a website or on a school podcast, or it could even be shared over PA systems of a school. Choral readings can be used for so many different purposes. I've seen them used for book weeks. I've seen them used for assemblies. You know, they can be done as kind of farewell gifts to staff members that are leaving. It's just a beautiful, beautiful strategy. And I wish that I had the recording of this group of students that had did a choral reading performance of the book Fire at an assembly. It was so powerful. That I've got a little activity for us to do. We'll see if it works. And it's for us to try to do a choral reading online this afternoon. Now, you can tell that I do this presentation in advance because we don't have anyone from Tasmania. But
I am.
Oh, really? Excellent, Sally. Yay! I thought we didn't. If you don't have if your state is not, I don't think we've got anyone from WA, do we, or Northern Territory? We do have people from Victoria though, yes. And South Australia as well, right? Okay, South Australia, Victoria. Feel free to just add yourselves in to another state if you'd like to contribute. Just, you know, buddy up with a state for our turn of choral reading, okay? I did pick this out of the hat and try to think of, okay, where are people generally signing in from? But, you know, it's such a varied sign-in that we do get. So we're going to have a go at reading Fire, or First Few Lines of Fire by Jackie French and Bruce Watley as a choral reading. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to read through the text and then we're going to try to do it all together. So you can see that I've highlighted parts where I'll read, then anyone from Taz. So we've got Sally doing that. But if anyone else would like to join Sally, I'm looking at you. Please. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Victorian, South Australian people. Anyone from Queensland? I know we have people from Queensland here. Then me. Oh, sorry. Then we all do this part. Fire flickered, fire crept. Then anyone from Queensland. Me again. Anyone from New South Wales or anyone that would like to join in. to New South Wales, and all again. So for this to work, we need to turn off our microphones. I'm going to read through it first, and then we'll do it all together, all right? All right, so I'll read through it first. One small spark brought fire awake, winding like a small black snake. Fire flickered, fire crept, flames snickered, bushfire leapt. Air too thick with ash to see, dry wind lash a bushfire see. Time to run, time to flee. Feel free to add as much enthusiasm to that reading as you want, okay? Are we ready? Let's go. 3, 2, 1. One small spark brought fire awake.
Winding like a small black snake.
Fire flickered, fire crept.
Flames snickered, bushfire leapt.
Air too thick with ash to see.
Dry
Flash.
Time
to run, time to flee. Amazing! That was amazing. Wow. And you have been recorded. And I'm sure that all the people that listen to this recording will be like, wow, how did they do that so amazingly? That was fun. Thank you, guys. So you can see it's a real performance strategy. It's a lot of fun. You can do it with 1 or 2 students, but I'd say collecting a little group of students, this would be a really great way of getting them into reading and also working on their fluency and their passion for stories. Now we're going to look at storyboards, and these are explained on page 59. I mentioned storyboards before when I was talking about how I'd use them for my students and working on their planning for stories. I'll just give you a moment if you also need to flick to storyboards on page 59 like I do. But when I was reading through the book, I noticed that they were described in quite an interesting way. They're described as a very structured strategy. So they're described for just one main purpose, which is to understand the structure of a narrative. Now, I think this is a really important use for them, and I'm going to go through the steps as if you're using it with this use in mind. However, this strategy, storyboards, can be used for many different ways. They do allow for planning of stories really well because they can allow students to think through all those little parts of their stories that they might not think through. They make students realise that actually everything that you put in a story needs to be thought about. And I've got students who love to put in tangents about sleepovers that happen and how every family member's involved and we get all their names at the very beginning of the story, but then you never hear from them again. Whereas storyboards really allow students to see that you can only insert those important details and to think about each detail that'll serve a purpose. So when students then plan with such purpose for their storyboards, it does translate into their narratives, and their narratives show that every part of their narrative will serve a purpose. I've also used storyboards as an excellent or as an assessment for visual literacy. I find that they're really excellent at being able to see what students see when they're interpreting moving images. So if you want students to be critiquing or evaluating, a video or even an animation, get them to jot it out in a storyboard. They also can help students pick apart, those different stories that they're reading. They can, as we talked about before, rather than writing down a recount, they can be drawing a storyboard of what they noticed in stories that they've read. They're also really good at planning movement for stories in drama or dance, and they're often used a lot in those areas. I've recently used them in planning coding presentations, and we've used the coding site Scratch. You can see the students working on it on the computer there. So this coding website allows students to kind of put in animations, move different characters around, put in text, and storyboards allow students to plan this out because it was frame by frame, almost like a little movie. So really you can see that storyboards can be used for a range of purposes. So now let's have a look at some of the steps of how to get students working with storyboards well. And these steps look at how you would model the use of a storyboard. So we choose a text first off, and we are going to assume that you're probably using it for a narrative structure. And we start with something that the students know there. Or you might be the text that you use for your modelled reading or your read aloud or your shared reading. You know, use that text that you've got in the class to model how you'd work on a storyboard. It might be that you've viewed a short film and you're going to now make a storyboard of that short film. I love the Pixar short films if you haven't seen them. In the second step, explain that storyboards have come from a visual storytelling background. So they're used to depict movement in a 2D form. So explain that because you need to then model that there'll be overlap between the different frames. And then you construct a storyboard together. And I'd suggest that you actually only construct like maybe the first 2 or 3 frames. And then you let the students share their thoughts and put their frames in. And never assume, though, that they're going to know exactly what they have to do before you say, okay, you give it a go. Do it together for a little while. Here, step 4 says to construct a feature list of what might need to be included and what images, be specific here, what images you'd expect and kind of what text you'd want underneath. For my storyboards, I often don't expect a lot of text, and it's a bit of a challenge actually for some students who like to write a lot of text to make it a visual storytelling activity and to say, you know, you can't put more than a sentence or 2 underneath each frame. So then for step 5, the students will create their own storyboards. Once you've done, you know, you've modelled them, you've explained the purpose, you've jointly constructed them, you've talked about the elements, then students will create their own storyboards. And that might happen a day or a few days later. So it doesn't have to be on the same day that you model it. And it doesn't actually have to use paper or pen. I mean, we've talked about, you know, the amazing connection that we have between pen and paper and the hand and the brain. But there are really engaging digital tools for storyboards now, and I'd highly encourage you to check these out, particularly if you have disengaged writers. I've used storyboards a lot with some of my disengaged writers, sometimes just as a stepping stone to get them to grab that pen and write it down. You might use them though with a purpose of wanting your students to explore the skills as visual creators or online, where you don't want any text or limited text. So it might actually be a challenge for some students. So the book also talks about just giving students 8 frames. I often actually give students more than that, and I'll print pages back to back of storyboard frames to even allow students to have unlimited sheets of storyboard frames. I think that storyboards need to be detailed, but they also need to be quite clear. And so you don't want students to feel restricted. You know, you don't want them to get to the 8th one and be like, oh, I actually wanted to put this in and this in and this in. It's better for students to come to you with like 25 frames and then you be able to cross them out or delete boxes later. Finally, step 6 is that you use the storyboards in some way. So just like any strategy, you don't do it for the sake of doing it. You use it as a launch pad for writing or creating or as a response to reflect with. So it's, you know, for a purpose. They're going to do it for a purpose. Okay, so for a little activity now, I'm going to share with you a website that I think is really useful. It's Storyboard, that website. And let's go back here so I can share the right page with you. I'll pop the URL as well in the chat if you want to head there. And you can have a little bit of a play. So here as well, you can see that you can add different settings to your storyboards and you just drag them down. You can change the colours of them and then you can put in your different characters. This one is free to use as well online, which is pretty impressive because there aren't a lot of storyboards that you don't have to sign into or log in. You know, you can actually just get online and start making them. You can start putting in some speech bubbles and some text then to your storyboards. So you're almost making it a little cartoon in a sense straight away. You can put in different graphics, different shapes. If you don't want them to use it as a comic strip, then get them to put their text bubbles down the bottom, make them nice and large, and then they can just be writing about what event's happening in that part. There is so many scenes and places, and this is a really fun and interactive way for students to be engaged in that planning of writing process. But this might also be an end goal. You know, they might do a paper and pen storyboard with the intention of creating a comic strip. And another very engaging way to engage our disengaged, a very engaging way, or great way to engage our disengaged writers. So storyboard that, and the link's there. But you also get this link and the other ones that I talk about at the end of the session. You'll get a follow-up maybe later this week. Can they be printed? I'm pretty sure they can. So I think when you save them, there's an option that you can download. Oh, there you go. You can log in. You can download them to an account, or sometimes what I do is I use a snipping tool, like a screen grabs tool, and I'll just print that off. I don't think you can print straight from here. I think you'd need to save it somewhere first and then print it. Yeah, a good one. Okay, so get back to, I hope that, yeah, if you do want to, go have a look and a play with storyboard that as an option for storyboarding. Here are some examples of some storyboards that I've used in my class. You can see that I give them a lot of squares, and sometimes the students use all of them and sometimes they don't. These were the storyboards that they created for their Scratch presentations as well. So they did this with the intention in mind that they'd have to be doing almost like a mini movie or moving images. So we talked about the fact that there'd need to be overlap between the images, so your characters wouldn't change from scene to scene. You'd actually have similar characters, just maybe doing something slightly different each time. And you can see as well how for some students it actually meant that they filled in all the boxes, that they then went and got extra sheets, they started making more, and then they would go through and they'd cross out, oh, actually, I don't need that scene, or that's a bit too much. Okay, moving on to our last strategy, it's word sorts. So flick to page 76. Are you ready? And our lovely group in Queensland gave us a little taster of what word sorts are all about. So we've talked about a lot of different strategies this evening, but I feel like I'd be doing you a disservice if we didn't touch on a spelling strategy. During the first workshop, some participants asked how spelling would fit into all of this. Well, spelling is a skill that can be developed from reading and writing. The words that you're studying should come from the reading and the writing that you're doing with the students anyhow. So word sorts are one of the most effective strategies that you can have up your sleeves if you want to make that spelling program text rich and authentic. You know, if you're going to use the text that you're working with, word sorts can help you to do that. And they work so fabulously for one-on-one with students as well. I've used word sorts in varying degrees across different year levels. I found them particularly useful in junior years when you are trying to get students to tune in to patterns in words and parts of words. Oh, like, you know, the example that we had earlier from that lovely group about the endings. You know, you might notice that ending pattern in words. I've used a variation as well in senior years where my students are then focusing on word etymology and we're looking at word origins and word roots. And seeing, okay, well, these words all have a Greek root or a Latin root. You can use word sorts for that as well. I've got a link here about word origins and word roots that I'll show you later on, another really lovely resource. Word sorts, though, remind us that In fact, spelling is much more than about a weekly list of words. In fact, spelling should never really just be a 10-word weekly test, because research has shown that this isn't effective. Spelling is an inquiry into language. It's about noticing patterns in words and questioning these, and word sorts can help us to do that. Word sorting is something that people are quite familiar with in the ACT, and I'm sure many states have been using programs around word sorting as well. We used B-spelling and Words Their Way quite extensively in the ACT. Well, these programs, although they are useful because they use word sorts, they actually derive their, and they're derived around word patterns, letter patterns. They're great for opening up students' eyes to identifying different letter patterns and relationships, but one of the main criticisms of these programs is that they're based on US pronunciation. So they can be slightly off for Australian English. So even more reason to contextualise the words that you're sorting with your students from the text that they're reading with you, from the words that they're writing in their books. And refreshingly, this book describes devising our own list of words. So I encourage you, grab it from the books that you've got in class. Use it even topic areas that you might be talking about. If you're working in the ELAD sector, or you've got some students who have English as an additional language, then you might be talking about some of those basic words that they're using, say, in maths, like ruler, pencil, and those words can become part of a word sort. By discovering the words for a word sort from all those texts that you've got in class, you might actually need to check that your students know those meanings of each word before you sort them, because they'll already be familiar with this language and the pronunciation of each, which you don't get if you've already got like a marketed word sort. Particularly, the students will know these words well if they've come from those shared readings. I'll show you a short clip as well of how to get some of these words out of the text that you're reading. Secondly, it's really importantly to jointly construct or jointly complete a word sort, where you model your thinking that occurs again when you're sorting the words. So you do those think alouds as you're doing a word sort with that student or with that group of students. You might make notes of what you're planning to say here as well. It's encouraged in the book that you complete a closed sort, where you have categories that are predetermined for the words. So, words that end in this sound, words that end in this sound, and so on. But I'd also suggest that you have an open sort where there are no preset categories. And here it takes a bit longer for students, where they just kind of inquire into any patterns that they see between the words, like, oh, I can see that some start with an A, let's put those together. Oh, these ones all have to do with fishing. Okay, let's put those together. And I've always found a need for an oddball category, no matter what kind of sort. You might have a closed one or an open sort. Having an oddball or a words that don't just fit category means that if students are a bit stuck with words, they can put them in that category and you can come back to them later. So after you feel that you've modelled and jointly constructed enough word sorts, give the students sets of words to sort by themselves. Ensure that you allow them some open, so with no kind of headings or areas that you want them to sort in, and some closed sorts. It's a really rich task if you actually even just allow students to find their own words from the words they're reading and also the words that they're struggling with in their writing. If they go through and underline those words that they've misspelt, those words then spelt correctly can form one of their word sorts. And then finally, sharing their word sorts can be a lot of fun. They can share with other students how they've sorted their words differently. They could just share with you what their thinking was behind when they were sorting their words, particularly if there are some words that were difficult in there or didn't quite fit the categories that you might have had. It adds this extra spelling inquiry part to the strategy. So I'll just show you first that Etymology Online site that I just spoke about. And it's lots of fun if you just want students to kind of tune into words and get excited about words, a bit of a word nerd site. This website, it's called Etymology Online, and it's another link that you'll get sent to you, but I've just put it in the chat as well. You can put any word in the search bar here. Let's go with Lego. And it comes up with the history of that word. It comes up with where that word actually came from. And so you can see the root words or the base words there. Another fun one to do is apple. There's a lot of history in the word apple. It's a great way to get students to tune into words and look at the meanings behind them, look at the reasons why they're spelt certain ways, and some of those tricky words have very tricky histories that make them tricky words. So Etymology Online was that little handy website to turn your kids that you're working with into word nerds, and it can be lots of fun for that kind of word investigation. I'm now going to show you a little video from Tessa DeFern's website. So Tessa is a spelling and literacy consultant in ACT, and I think she's also doing some work in New South Wales. And she has a great little video that actually shows how she would work through with a student from reading a text to then creating their own list of words for a word sort. So let's just head there.
With never a please or a thank you, the rat carried on in this way. Flies, flies from a spider. Milk from a cat. Delight, fright, high, cyclone.
So then rather than just writing it down and leaving it and then putting it on cards, by doing this and highlighting those words again, they're noticing those parts of the words ready for their sort. So almost a middle step there that Tessa includes.
High, my.
And then this is the word sort. So this is where they're sorting the words. You can see they've got some categories there. They might have written those, or that might be something that you write.
Right.
The teacher writes for them.
Y. Cycle. Sky.
So you can see there was a bit of stopping between.
Glide.
And then they move on from that to then look at
gliding.
The meaning of that word. How do you change that word, that verb? So what I think stands out to me in that video is that rather than just giving a list, Tessa is reading the book with the child and they're listening to the words, they're writing them down. The students you work with might be able to do that, might be able to just tune into the words from the reading and following with their finger, or they might need a bit more prompting as well to notice what words have certain spelling sounds. But yeah, a beautiful way of finding those words for our word sort. I talked about how really you can use a word sort to sort words in any way that you want. So here I've got a list of words, and these could be sorted by syllables, 1 syllable, 2 syllables, 3 syllables. So you can sort words by syllables, sort words by the grapheme or the spelling letter, the letters that relate to sounds. You can even sort words by the parts of speech, and you look at the verbs and the nouns. So one sort can be used in many different ways. If you want students to look at those words over and over again, use it in a different way. Make it an open sort next time. During the first workshop, I talked to the participants about only having one takeaway, one goal, or one thing that they want to implement or have a go at And I think it's important that we take time to pause before we finish this evening and think about what your takeaway is. You know, is it that you'd like to do some modelled writing with a student that you're working with or a group of students? Is it that you want to start doing an author study, and maybe there's an author you've got in mind for a student that you just want to grab all their books and have them on their desk? You want to maybe do some choral reading and have it as a little performance piece or as something to work towards maybe for a student you're working with, that you perhaps want to give word sorts a try and use a book that you're working on for word sorts, or do some storyboards, maybe some editing checklists or some editing practice is something that you think your students would get a lot from. So have a moment now, have a bit of a think about, you know, what your goal might be. It might be a shared reading that you really want to do, that you're going to take one of those lovely books that everyone suggested and have it as a shared reading. And now we've got 5 minutes for questions, but also if you want to share what your takeaway is, you can do that now. If you have any questions about anything that I've talked about this evening, you feel free to ask them. If you've got questions about strategies that I haven't talked about, you can also ask them.
Libby, I wanted to, I guess my takeaway would be going back to the author study and maybe getting the children or the child, whether it's a group or one-on-one, to perhaps identify with one of the characters in the book and actually talk about their interpretation from the character's point of view of what the author is actually talking about, or the story that is being presented. So they could, you know, pretend to be one of the characters in the story, as they're talking about, you know, what the author is trying to tell the reader.
That's an interesting way of going around it. I like it. And I think even just, you know, making that author, that was a piece of work that this person has poured effort into, you know, making that so clear to kids can be really powerful as well.
Or what, you know, what the you know, the children, or what characters they would identify with.
Yeah.
And if they, you know, if they feel that the author was convincing, I guess, with that character.
Yeah. And even starting with step 1 of an author study, you know, if you're lucky and have a library on your school grounds, being able to go with your students and say, oh, you know how we've been reading all these books by Babette Cole? Well, this is where we find them. Like, this is the point in the library where we find them. So. The criteria group 3 worksheets. Do you mean, I think you must mean the success criteria? Yeah. Yeah, I did make them hard to read because I don't want you to copy them. I want you to make it personalised for your students. So, you know, what they think should go into a narrative orientation, complication resolution. Helen, yeah, word sorts, wonderful. No, I don't think so at all, Kerry. You know, and it might be that you start out with a storyboard, that you use the storyboard to talk about a story that you've looked at, and then perhaps you pull out, you think about it, but you could do the words underneath for the young students or the very low students, and then they, you know, you take those words from the storyboard and that becomes your word sort, if that's the way you're thinking, or you could do the reverse. I guess my thinking, Kerry, in the one takeaway is that for you, you know, to enact more than one strategy at a time, that takes a lot of effort and time on your behalf. So I really think it's good to have one goal. You know, you go into the classroom or you go work with that student tomorrow and you think, today is my day to try word sorts or shared reading or success criteria with this kid. Yeah, wonderful. Some great takeaways there. So I truly hope that the strategies in this book have opened up your eyes to different ways of doing things with the children you work with. I know that there are so many roadblocks to good teaching. There are tests, there are programs, there are administrators, there are parents, and there are more programs. And I know that a lot of you are constrained in the way you work, and that all those different voices that we have in classrooms that tell us to do things one way or another, and often those voices don't even belong in a classroom. I highly encourage and hope for all of you is that although sometimes you might have to listen to these other voices, that there is space for change in the profession and a positive change in the way in which we work with students that allow these students to just blossom. So I love this post by Shel Silverstein, and I think that it rings true as well for the work that you do. You know, that listen to those mustn'ts, child, listen to the don'ts, listen to the shouldn'ts, the impossibles, the won'ts, listen to the never has, then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child, anything can be. And some of you might have sat there this evening and thought, well, I've actually got to do this and this and this and this and this. I can't fit all this in, but actually anything can happen. Anything can be. So thank you so much again for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording now, and there is a survey link there. So if you would like to give some feedback, I'll pop that in the chat in just a moment. I also have my email there for you. If you have more questions that we haven't got to, I'm happy to answer them as well as they come. I love some of the ideas and feedbacks that I'm seeing there in the chat. Great thinking. I also have a blog where I share some of my ideas on writing and reading and speaking. And I've newly started an Instagram. I'm learning the Insta teacher world, read, write, speak, repeat. So if you're on Instagram and you want to follow someone who is trying to look at the right way, or not the right way, the best way to do things, do give us a follow or connect with me there. Anyhow, it was lovely to meet you all. I hope that you can enjoy your evenings.